Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Tom Oliver. Haven't done a 3D video in a long time. However, recently, about a month ago, I put up a test animation recreating a Guilty Gear instant kill animation using this character right here, Izumi. And I kind of put together this shader. It's a very simple shader, but it's a pretty cool shader. And I got some questions on Newgrounds and on Twitter on how the shader was put together and how the effect was done. So I'm just going to explain it pretty quickly right now for anybody who's interested in getting this pretty effective but simple to set up pen and ink kind of look on a 3D model. So the selling point I feel in this technique is the fact that we're basically getting a vector-esque effect. Now, the texture for this is 1024 by 1024, which is not huge. But, like, if we zoom in, there's not really any pixelation. You get a little bit of fraying on the edges when you get super close. But, like, anyone who knows anything about 3D knows that 1024, zoomed into this degree, usually doesn't maintain such crisp edges. And there's a very simple way we can take this and get these crisper edges on a low-resolution texture. And there's no reason why you can't go higher. You could double the resolution and still have a pretty good performance and get a much crisper edge when you zoom in close. But for my needs, since I work mostly on a laptop that has integrated graphics, wanted to keep everything pretty low, because even this technique as is pretty taxing on integrated graphics. I wasn't able to play back that animation in real time on a UHD 630 notebook. However, it seems to be working fine on my desktop with an RX 580, so it's not like super taxing, especially at this low poly count. But I'm kind of getting into the weeds already. What is this effect and how does it work? So the idea that I was going for is I wanted to have a black and white shader that was able to simulate the look of pen and ink, have like a very bold, crisp sort of outline and detail lines, but I didn't want to have a huge, massive texture to maintain that crispness. So what I did is, for the outline itself, which is just like the outline around the entire character, that's just the standard inverted hull method. I have another video on my channel talking about it. I'll link it in the cards. That was done with 2.7, but the setup is almost identical in 2.8, so I don't think you'll have too much trouble following along. But for the actual texture itself, if we go into, I guess, UV editing, well, kind of spoiling it here. Let's go into image editor. If we go to, here's the texture, and you can see as we zoom in, it's still pretty pixelated. It's not exactly amazing or anything, and there's kind of a lot of wasted space, but it's very simple, and there's not a lot of detail going on here. It's very low resolution. So what you want to do to set this up is, if we go back into shader editor and I select the right one on the character, which would actually, we're already on the right one here. So what's going on is we start with the texture. We have a diffuse BSDF, but you can use anything. I just used diffuse because it was simple. There's a transparent node up here, but I don't think for this particular texture I needed any transparency. It's kind of floating from a previous texture. Put them into a mix shader if you want to have transparency. But the key really is these two nodes right here. This is shader to RGB and color ramp. So let me get out of camera view in this window so we can kind of see the effects happen. Oh dear, the scale is wonky. I'm going to tab out of that. We're going to go into this so you can see the effects. Okay, and actually we'll go into render view because we're in EV. So let's get rid of shader to RGB, and let's get rid of all this stuff. And it's going to look a little weird because I have two different textures for the face rig, but that's okay. Let's just take this flat image texture, right? Let's go straight to the output as normal. So you can see you get the typical results, right? This is what the effect would look like as normal. Very low resolution texture. As you get closer, all of a sudden you're getting the expected distortion and stuff, which is no good. It looks crappy up close, and if you watch the animation, you know there's a lot of very close-ups of the face and stuff, and it looks wonky. Like certain older games on like the Wii, and like this reminds you kind of like Mad World. Sometimes you get really close to objects in Mad World, they kind of take on this texture, or any cell shaded style game. There's some places in Okami where the textures can get a little blurry like that as well. But you can see up here, because the face is its own separate texture, you can see it's much crisper. Like this area is crisp and the eye is very crisp versus the nose, which is not in that overlay for facial expressions, is very janky. And that's where these two nodes come into play. So the first thing you want to do is take your mix shader, or if you're not doing transparency, just your straight diffuse or whatever resolver you want to use for that. Plug it into a shader to RGB node. From here, you're going to take the color and put it into the factor of a color ramp. And so what the color ramp does is it's basically saying take all the shader data and turn it into these colors. You want to make sure you're set to constant, because if you're on any of these other ones, it's going to subtly blend them into each other, and that's not what we want. We want to have a nice hard crisp edge. So we're going to go to constant again. And I've picked two colors, simply black and white. Now you can choose any colors you want. If I wanted to make this red, I could. Change the hue, tangerine, blah, 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 you know, whatever. Have like a maroon sort of thing. We can do that too. And if I take the color and put it in a surface, you can see now it's all maroon colored. But basically what it does is, because it's taking the texture data and making it just a flat color, and we're saying only use these two binary values here, it smooths out a lot of the pixelation, because now it's just using raw color data instead of the image of the texture itself. It's just using that as a reference. And you're saying use the color as the factor for splitting between these two values. And as you scale these up and down, you can adjust how harsh or how weak the shadows are cast on the model. And so you can really have some fine-tuned control on how this works. And you can even invert it if you want to have a crazy look. But this is how the shader works. I can take these and make them any colors. I can bring it back to black. I can take this white color, I can make it something totally different. So there's a lot to play with here, which is pretty cool. And the exact same effect is being used here on the scarf. If I click on the scarf, but this is just using different colors. So this is kind of a more traditional way of doing cell shading in Eevee or Cycles. That's actually how I kind of stumbled upon this effect. So I was trying to do some cell shading stuff, and then I realized it'll affect the underlying texture as well as not just the material. So with this one, I have the transparent going through the mix shader, because there's some holes in her scarf if we look down here, so that's what allows the holes. And what's nice is, like, this scarf is, again, really low resolution, but because this is kind of converting it all to color value, no matter how close you get, the holes still appear really crisp. They don't pixelate and look messed up. So this really helps with maintaining that kind of sharp 2D pen and ink, almost vector-like appearance to the texture. And so again, you can adjust these, make the shadows brighter or less depending on how you want to do it. You can also mix multiple colors. So if we go swing around back here to Azumi's sword, Akumaru, he has a couple colors on his eye. And what you do for that, this one's a little bit more complicated, because I have a couple textures going over them. But you just add a couple extra stops. And you got to fiddle with these to make sure they line up, because the base texture on this character, if we go to it, which is here, his eye is already those colors roughly. So when we go back into the shader, I've used those colors that I want. Why did it unzoom? I was like in the perfect location for this, and you messed me up. Oh boy. All right. Let's turn these off. I want to see all the UI stuff. So you can see there's black, white, orange, and yellow, and those are all the colors in here. As I adjust the stops, I don't know why it keeps dragging the nodes. I adjust the stops, it'll change how little or how much of those values show up. So you kind of have to fiddle around with it a little bit. You can see if I blow it out, all of a sudden that takes over the eye. So you can see this is pretty effective, because this is a tiny object. I'm zoomed in pretty close to it, and it's still retaining its crispness pretty well. The brush strokes on the hilt are still pretty sharp. The eye is really sharp, and actually I can show the eye a little bit better if I tweak the shape key, dial this down. There you go. You can see the eye is very crisp, even at this incredibly close-up zoom. Everything on Izumi's body, even that close, like the detail on the hilt. And these are only, This is a tiny section of a 1024 image, and it's still coming through really crisply. So, yeah, you can probably do more things if you wanted to go full color, but since I'm really interested in that black and white aesthetic, and a limited color, like have each character have like one or two kind of accents of color with an overall black and white, I thought this was pretty cool. So there you go. That's how it's done. Leave any questions you might have about the specifics in the comments. Don't worry about this. This is just to overlap the underlying texture in the eye, which I can go over if people have questions about that. That's just kind of like overlaying textures. But there you go.